Okay. So welcome to our Fireside chat with Shumela and Ashley. So today's chat is informal, it's unstructured, it's unplanned, and a bit different from our panel events. This is just a chat between two survivors, two experts in their field, where other organisations and people can learn a lot from them. So we've come together to let them chat. If you hadn't heard them chat together before, and we will try and keep this to 20 minutes. So first of all, do you want to both just introduce yourselves? So Ashley.
I am the CEO and founder of Thriving Survivors. We work with people who are affected by childhood sexual abuse, domestic abuse, drugs, alcohol. We work with anybody that's fallen on hard times and needs a bit of support to come through it.
Thanks, Ashley. Shumela?
Hi, I'm Shumela. I'm Managing Director at Resilience Learning Partnership. We're a lived experience-led organisation and we specialise in trauma-informed practice and lived experience.
Thank you. Right, so let's kick off with the whole topic is about trauma-informed practice. It's the subject that we've been looking at for the last 4 to 6 weeks. So let's chat about how it's designed just now, how it looks and how it's currently operating and your thoughts on that. So Ashley, do you want to go first?
I think probably Shumela would have been better to go to first here because Shumela had a hand in creating the trauma-informed training plan for Scotland. So it's what most organisations within the Inspiring Scotland portfolio aspire to, and it's where a lot of people get their resources for trauma-informed practice from. I've certainly learned a lot from it. It's been incredibly useful as I've sort of built the organisation, but I think I'll pass straight to Shumela on this one, who can be far more of an expert than I can.
Thank you, Ashley. I would never claim to be more of an expert than you, certainly. As Ashley said, yeah, RLP and myself had a hand in creating the National Trauma Training Plan, so Section 3 in particular on co-production and how you actually involve people with lived experience and trauma-informed practice. I suppose that's one of the most fundamental things about how trauma-informed practice is designed and then implemented, is that people with lived experience of trauma have got to be at the heart of it. At the heart and start was what somebody said in the last meeting I was in there, and that really is it. So, you know, trauma-informed practice is based on 5 key principles, which are choice, collaboration, empowerment, trust and safety. I don't believe you can practice those principles without having the people who are accessing your service at the heart of your practice. So in themselves, that's what they do. There's also a 6th one that's being currently added on, which is culture, because it's always important to remember the cultural context in which trauma happens in, but that's developing and new and something for people to maybe look into and learn a wee bit more about outside of this. They are then supported by the 6 R's, which I've mentioned before, and they focus on things like respecting resilience, respecting the relationships, because trauma happens often and primarily in and through relationships, but it's also healed. Trauma is healed through the relationships that we have, both with ourselves and with other people in our lives. I think when you talk about where it's at in Scotland just now, that's one of the really interesting things. So having been involved in the creation of the trauma training plan 3 years ago and watching where things are now at, I don't often get people saying to me, what's trauma-informed practice? Not in this sector anyway, sorry, you know, outside of the sector, it's common, but actually there are some areas outside of the sector that are starting to take on this as well. So that's really interesting. I think there's a lot of things currently happening in Scotland. A lot of plans are being created. Some plans are running ahead. Some people are still at ground zero on this. And so the Robertson's Trust recently are doing some funding on a change project. So I know that some of the bids in that fund are specifically looking to implement trauma-informed practice right throughout their whole organisation. So plans are starting. I suppose many people are at different stages of those plans just now as well, but local authorities have a direct agenda from Scottish Government to ensure that they're implementing this, and that opens up a whole world of stuff. I'm sure some of it that we'll touch on today on what that looks like within a local authority and things like that.
So why is trauma-informed practice so important within organisations, individuals, and doctor surgeries? Why? Tell everyone. So obviously you're saying within the organisations and within your sector, people know what it is, but outside of it, perhaps not. So can you discuss it? What is it, and why it's so important?
I think one of the fundamental things to remember about trauma-informed practice is it's not something that treats trauma, or that isn't what trauma-informed practice is about. The most important thing about trauma-informed practice is understanding its prevalence and therefore its impact on people, because then what we can do is design our services and our practice around that. Being trauma informed, really what it means is understanding the impact that someone's trauma and experiences has had on them, and how that then may create barriers to care, support, or engaging with any of the other public services that to live an active, healthy life, you should be able to access without any barriers at all. But we find that people who have experienced multiple disadvantage and multiple trauma and complex trauma have there's real significant barriers, and often they're not so much structural, or they can be, but often they can be down to the interactions that we have, how we're made to feel when we walk into a dentist's reception, or when we go into the dentist's chair, and if we feel judged, if we're not informed about what might be happening within the examination or the appointment. These are all things that we know can be red flags to someone who's experienced trauma, and can make them feel really anxious, uncomfortable, threatened, and they can be changed very, very easily in our day-to-day practice within simple services. And as I say, it can often take down the barriers for people to engagement.
Ashley, can you give some examples of what sort of things could create, ongoing trauma for somebody? So like the doctor, surgery, smear tests, dentists, what can cause trauma to somebody, and what's happening just now, and what do you think we can do about, a specific subject?
There's a loaded question, Heather. That's a big question to answer. I think in terms of the ongoing impact on people, it's different. If you've lived it, you can actually put yourself and almost understand what the person you're supporting is going through. You can almost foresee the barriers. You can understand that when they're saying to you, they've avoided this appointment, and I've avoided that appointment. Well, why are we avoiding those appointments? Let's have that conversation, because if you're avoiding, let's take the job centre as an example. The job centre is a big thing where people don't want to go to work assessments, and they've got to fill in these big long forums. How do you write into these forums, and how do you go and speak to work coaches and lay bare your soul? Especially the more serious the crime, the harder it is to try and explain that. There's a constant turnover of work coaches within job centres, which means that you're constantly having to tell that story over and over and over again, just for you to get a bit of understanding as to why it's difficult to go over the door, why I would rather have a phone call appointment as opposed to coming to your office. I think the world that we live in now has opened up some of that, being able to choose between how we, being able to choose how we access services. I think that has changed in the past year due to the pandemic, but not because it's people's trauma-informed approach or because it's a trauma-informed practice. It's because it's been forced upon people. It would be better if GPs, DWP workers took a step back and actually looked at the person in front of them and seen beyond the book cover, and actually started to look at the pages that lie within, because that's where you really start to see the depth of anxiety and frustration and fear that so many survivors face. When I look at myself as an example, and I can list many, many more people that I've supported that have had the exact same experience. Going to your GP and you get a male doctor, when actually you're going to the GP to talk through this really deep, really sore, very sensitive matter, and you've got no choice but to sit there with the doctor that's facing you, as opposed to being able to choose which doctor you have, being able to have choice and safety. And you know, the key principles of trauma-informed practice, those need to ripple down. It's all one saying we are trauma-informed. Are you really trauma-informed, or have you just did a bit of training? Did that training involve somebody who's got lived experience standing in front of you so that you can ask those questions? So I believe the way that Shumela delivers a trauma-informed training is the way that it should be done across this country. In fact, I just think it's the way it should be done, full stop, because it's delivered by people who have lived experience. When Shumela delivers this stuff, you're able to ask Shumela questions that you simply cannot ask somebody who's been to university that doesn't have the same life experience as what she does. Same with, if we look at dentists, again, there's so many. We could be here for months talking through this conversation. We look at the dentist. I avoid the dentist still to this day unless I have got excruciating pain in my face. Right, I'm missing teeth. My teeth are in a terrible state, and I still avoid the dentist, even though I now consider myself to be in a place where I know why I avoid the dentist. I'm fully aware of it, and I also think there might just be a bit of normal fear in there that I might just not like the dentist. But for me, there's a lot in going in and sitting in that chair and being judged, because my teeth aren't as shiny white as what somebody else's are, or because I've got a missing tooth at the back, or the tooth that was knocked at the front, that I'll be judged upon. And that for me, as somebody who's in a good place and has who's built my resilience, who's got a good mindset, is still very difficult for me. So to look at somebody who's in the height of their trauma and trying to navigate all these different services, there needs to be a collaboration here. There needs to be not just myself dealing with clients, not just the dentist dealing with clients, not just the GP. It needs to be a collaborative approach here, which again pulls in another principle of trauma-informed practice, that we need to be working together to make sure that every survivor, regardless of what the experience is treated with respect and compassion, safety, you know, all these other things that people just often don't see. And this isn't a failing. I'm not picking up on failings of organisations here. It's just a lack of awareness on some people's cases, because I'm sure if I sat and spoke to my dentist, and I think after hearing Jeremy on the panel, I'm going to have that conversation with my dentist on why it's so difficult for me to come in here and speak to you. So even I'm still learning as we go, and Jeremy really enlightened me when I was watching the panel. So it's a two-way street, and I completely agree with that aspect of it, but more needs to be done, and more people need to raise their level of awareness beyond their own wee bubble, if you like, and to be looking at how can I help the person who sat in front of me in a better way.
So,
sorry, I was just going to add to that a bit there, Heather, about, I'm so glad you said that, Ashley, because again, going back to, you know, I'm always harping on about this when I talk to other leaders about how useful trauma-informed practice is at an organisational level. And I'll use the example of a university. So when I was trying to sell to them how important it was to get their admission staff and other staff at least trauma-informed level 1, the way I put it to them was, when we talk about trauma, and that's the thing about, you know, me and Ashley, there will probably be things in our lives until we're no longer here that will always be slightly heightened or triggered. You know, triggers are such mental nuanced things that we can't control them, and we'll never fully understand them. And therefore there will be times in our lives where things happen and it brings up stuff from our past for us, but now we've got all the structures and buffers in our lives to make sure that we don't go down, you know, maybe a destructive path, but actually we're able to stay safe and secure and all of that. What trauma-informed practice does is it helps everyone. It isn't just there for people who have experienced the kind of lives me and Ashley have experienced, because we have type 1 and we have type 2 trauma. Me and Ashley are the kind of poor souls who have experienced both intertwined throughout life. But there are those individuals in society who will only experience a type 1, like a one-off incident, or a natural disaster, a car accident, even as something as horrific as a rape, a one-off isolated attack, if you have all the other buffers and supports in your life, there's a much better chance of recovery, quicker, you're much less likely to be impacted. But for somebody experiencing that, let's say in childhood sexual abuse, constant for years and years, and then they grow up and go into a domestically violent situation and they live in a geographically violent area with lots of high crime and drugs, all of those things, they make it much more complex. But trauma-informed practice encompasses all of that. Those who experience type 1, those who experience type 2, and those who experience both throughout their lives. And anybody else is either really, really lucky in life, because we all will experience loss at some point. Okay, not everyone may be impacted in the same way, but most likely or not, people will be impacted by some sort of loss at some point in their lives, and sudden loss especially, but even known loss, when you know it's coming, creates the same kind of trauma often as some of the other things we've touched on today. When you learn more about trauma and trauma-informed practice and the impact of trauma and what it actually looks like out there and all the human beings that you have ever interacted with, it gives you a new level of understanding of why things happen. And that's just it for everybody. It really is.
So I'm from out with the sector, and so learning about trauma-informed practice, who is there, who actually gets it just now in regards to, are there organisations that compulsory have to have trauma-informed practice, or is it always a voluntary things for people to train in, such as house doctors and housing associations, and who should get it? I mean, I'm thinking, so myself, my company, I've got 2 members of staff, and I'm sitting thinking, well, I wouldn't know how to speak to them or get the information from them if they needed help. So is there, I guess what I'm asking is there people that already have it because they have to have it, or is it all voluntary? And people who are listening to this who may not have ever had trauma-informed practice or thought about it, how do they go about it? And is the training the same? That's a really big question. So yeah, on you go.
Shumela, do you want to kick off on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really big question, but at the moment it isn't mandatory or statutory, but I would possibly think that might be coming. If not, in that sense, it would be very much something that was, this has been in programme for government for the past 2 years. It's in it for the next 2 years. So it is not going anywhere. The Scottish Government's directive is all public services staff must be trained to at least trauma-informed level 1. Then you go up to skilled and enhanced and specialist, and that's much more for people working in the sector. But when we think about informed, we're thinking about school cleaners, receptionists, any sort of front-facing member of the public services workforce within councils, the NHS, schools, should at least be trauma-informed level, because again, it's back to that understanding the prevalence and the impact just helps us regardless in our everyday practice. There are different forms of training out there designed by different people. I would always point people towards NHS Education for Scotland resources when you're looking organisationally at the questions you need to start asking to look at implementing or even just finding out more. There's a whole website now created which is called transformingpsychologicaltrauma.scot. You'll get that with a simple Google search, where there's access to a whole load of free resources for organisations at all different levels. You can seek trauma training from any of the kind of private providers out there. We would always recommend that you either get a lived experience organisation out to deliver your training, or I'm a big fan of collaboration. It's one of the key principles, and so I can often say to people, why don't we could put something together, if you like, we could co-facilitate, because when we go in to train staff, it's usually around some sort of other learning and development, or they've already got lots of learning and development resources, and it's about adding into that, or just making it much more of a collaborative process, because it's that thing that Ashley said about being able to ask those questions that you wouldn't if you didn't have lived experience in the room. and always to remember that bringing lived experience into a room shouldn't just be to hear stories or find out about somebody's experiences. We found a new way of doing that. It's actually having survivors and other people with lived experience actively involved in creating the learning and development resources that we use and delivering them. Because you know, as a lived experience led organisation, it's very easy for us to do that. I get that as well, but it's important for people to remember that this isn't an add-on, and it can't become tokenistic. A lot of that using people who access these services to feed into our services often can be. We need to find trauma-informed, meaningful, and authentic mechanisms for people to be able to feed in, be involved, co-deliver, co-design, co-facilitate. We're trauma-informed as regarded.
It was interesting when we did the panel events back in April, and we had survivors and we had professors and organisations all talking together. And if you look specifically at the, you know, your professors and those from academic education, they knew all the facts and everything, but you could never argue with what the survivor was saying. They, you know, at the end of the day, they are the experts in their experience. So I think kind of we've both mentioned it, but is that why it's so important that the survivors are involved in the writing of this training? You know, can somebody that's not been in their shoes really write the training?
Anybody could write up a training programme. Absolutely anybody. You go to NES, like Shumela had said, go into NES, you've got millions of resources there. You can easily build a training course that you can deliver to your staff, to anybody. There's lots out there, but it simply cannot give you what somebody with lived experience can give you. And if you have different modules within your trauma-informed training package, if you like, then you can look at different types of trauma, and that means that you can really hone in, you can really specialize that, and you can tailor that to whatever organization you're delivering it to. Just to pick up on what we previously mentioned when Shumela had spoke about making sure people were trained to the basic level, I think everybody, absolutely every single person, has a right to be trauma informed, because we often see people presenting to us and they are in a state of vulnerability, and it ripples out through an entire family. So what about the husband and the children and all the other people that get wrapped up in that traumatic experience? How do they deal with the trauma? How do they then deal with the person in the house who is broken and who is very vulnerable at that point? And I think everybody has got a right to be trauma informed to that basic level. So that was just something that I wanted to pick up on. But yeah, there I go on my soapbox.
No, it's really not actually, Ashley, because one of the things that we're just about to start in the next month or so is actually taking this stuff that we've been doing for the past 3 years, primarily either with professionals or with groups of survivors and different kind of, I suppose, to some extent, to use the word, controlled environments, because it's through one of our programs or our pathways or whatever. What we're about to test and do is taking this out to the community, and that's through our partnership work with Sanctuary Housing Association, one of those organisations, Heather, who really isn't bound the same as most of our statutory services or our other public services. This is a private housing association that does make lots of profit and does operate very much in the private sector, but actually draws a lot of public funds through housing benefit and building, you know, in deprived areas, things like that. They are beginning to implement trauma-informed practice at an organisational level, but also alongside that, they've now employed, I think it's 2 or 3 different community builder. That's the name of the job role. And the job role is basically an assets-based community development approach, which is trauma-informed, to working within the community, not just of sanctuary housing tenants, but actually of the wider community, whoever wants to be part of it. And we'll be a fundamental part of that. And condensing some of what we do into like half-day 2-hour workshops and going out and beginning to speak to on a community level about this. to the wee woman that just takes the Waynes to the school, or the granny down the road that still helps out at the cafe on a Friday at the community centre, to start helping people, because I've seen through our work the fundamental transformation and change in people, when and a lot it's about validation. You know, there's people out there floating about traumatized. No, everybody is, and that's one of the arguments that comes into the realm with trauma, about it being too medicalized and clinical, and I get that and I understand that, and I want to bring down some of those barriers around that. But there are people walking about out there who have no idea why they might feel the way that they do, why they've got an addiction, why they can't maintain a tenancy, why they can't maintain a healthy relationship. And when people begin to understand the prevalence and the impact of trauma, they begin to understand, and it opens you up. That doesn't mean to say everybody needs therapy or an analysation of their trauma, but just beginning to understand that actually maybe growing up and going to school and getting hit with a bell and a cane like my mum did wasn't normal, and is now illegal in this country and in most places in the world. And that if you know, there's a whole generation of people walking about like that in our country, especially in Scotland, or who grew up in families like that, and who were like, oh, I could hide and never done me any wrong. But when you start to learn about actually the implications of violence, particularly in childhood, you might start to go, oh God, right, okay. And you know, you go on a path of kind of self-discovery. We want to take that out there into communities, and it might be good actually to get you along actually to some of those
it's like I'm sitting here and I'm like, oh, that sounds great. It sounds brilliant. That's what needs to happen here. I've heard often that survivors are broken, vulnerable individuals that don't know. At one point recently, a doctor told me that survivors don't know their own mind. And I instantly thought, this clearly isn't somebody who has ever experienced a traumatic event ever, and they are very much reading from a textbook. I tell you, see the survivors that I work with and that we work alongside with every day, their strength blows me away. And when we start to talk about trauma-informed practice, there's a lot of hesitance in getting survivors involved in case we re-traumatize people. Should that not be the choice of the survivor as to whether they wish to get involved and actually to use their experience in a way that's helpful and productive and does something good out of it? Far too often we see big organisations, statutory organisations, we can't involve survivors. If you don't, you will be left behind, because this is the way it's going to move forward. Now, survivors must be at the heart of everything that we do. As a lived experience organisation, everybody that's with us has experienced something. All our experience varies. There's a lot of it in amongst us all, but it's experience that's now been used for good. It's experience that has been turned on its head, and that each individual person brings something very, very different to the table. Every one of us unique, every one of us with our own different backgrounds and experiences, not broken, not vulnerable, but resilient and empowered and more than capable of being out there and being functioning members of society, if not excelling at being members of society, at being involved in this field. I think that's the way things are going. There is a shift in things, and people need to recognise that survivors, just because they've experienced, whether it be type 1 or type 2 trauma, doesn't mean they're broken and useless and should be flung on the scrap heap. In fact, they're the people that will change the shape of the third sector.
You know, I read a quote recently, and I can't remember it word for word, but I'll share it at the end of the video. And it said, you'll always recognise a survivor, even if you don't know if they are one, because they're the strongest people you'll ever come across. And having sat and worked with you, Ashley, for months now, and the people that have come across and survivors, it's 100% true. Honestly, they're tougher and stronger than most people I know. So yeah, I totally agree with that. So I'm aware of time, so let's just go on to the final topics of conversation about trauma-informed practice within the third sector just now, and your thoughts on how that is looking just now.
I think most organisations in the third sector that are dealing with any sort of survivor are making attempts to become trauma informed. Some are excelling because of the way their organisation's established. So Shumela, myself, our organisations are very much trauma informed from the top right down to that operational volunteer level, where even our volunteers are trauma informed. Whereas I think there's still some gaps, and there's certain trauma informed practices maybe not being carried out the way that they should be. It's tokenistic, to use Shumela's words from earlier. I think some of the training that's implemented in the third sector just now is tokenistic, and more needs done. Let's not forget that there's a lot about the person who's being trauma informed and the skills and the qualities that they themselves need to have. And sometimes you see people in the third sector that perhaps don't quite fit within the third sector remit, if you like. I'm trying to be clever with my words. But yeah, I think there's more could be done within the third sector and being trauma informed, because that is the place that the NHS defer to. The NHS, Police Scotland, all these big statutory organisations defer to the third sector. If there's a sector that needs to be trauma informed, it should be this sector. So yeah, Shumela, I'll let you pick up on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's moved a bit in the past 3 years, and one of the things I suppose that Nez has identified over the past 18 months is that a lot of this was only driven towards the public sector. That's where the resource was, and that's where people could get the support to implement within their organisations. Nez have realised that they had to provide the same for the third sector. And they've opened that right up, and it will open up even more so the third sector can access all of the free resources that I spoke about. There's also the trauma skilled module, which is really good for organisations to get their staff doing if it's appropriate, and that again is free to access through TURAS, which is great. I think one of the fundamental things for the third sector to really remember that this isn't just about trauma training. Trauma training should be the beginning of your journey. Our trauma training comes in and it does the basics of trauma training and educates people and raises awareness, but it fundamentally throughout reinforces the importance of this isn't just about training. This is just the start of your journey. You need to go away from here and now and think, especially the leaders in the room or the more senior staff, how does this trickle through my whole organisation, right from board level down to the coalface and everything in between, particularly around policies and procedures, because they're often one of the things that re-traumatise people when they enter into the system. And that's one of the things we can really, really change, the forms that people have to fill out, what's said in those forms. If they even need to fill in a form, for some of our pathways, because who does that serve? We can get their information when they start, we put it down in a file, it's there, we've got it. Making people fill out endless forms for what reason? To cover your own backside, not to swear. What purpose does it serve? Looking at these policy things that happen every day in organisations and really beginning to say, is this re-traumatising people? Is this necessary? Is it disempowering? Is it creating a barrier to engagement within our service? Do we really need it? We call it taking a trauma-informed lens to your organisation, really looking at every aspect of it and asking, how does this really serve? Who does it really serve? Who does it serve is the most important question we can ask, I think.
Excellent, thanks ladies. So final bit for you to finish up on. Why is it so important to be trauma informed? Ashley.
I think for the person who sat in front of you, for you yourself, to have a level of trauma informed knowledge, to have an awareness of an awareness and a level of understanding for the person who sits directly across from you, to be able to understand why they behave in a certain way, and then to be able to have the open conversation about how you can break down those barriers is a fundamental lesson that everybody should undertake. It's not just about saying we are trauma informed. It's about demonstrating and showing that you're trauma informed, and the only people that can testify to that are the survivors that you work with. So I would say to every organisation, whether you are statutory, third sector or private sector, become trauma informed. Don't just participate in the training, but like Shumela said, let it trickle right from the very top, right down to the coalface, so as that when you've got somebody presenting on your door and they've maybe missed a few shifts at work and something's not quite right, they are not actually facing disciplinary, they're not facing any of these things. You're having that conversation with them to fully understand why they're behaving in the way that they are. And then from there, you've got a level playing field. Everybody should be trauma informed. If you aren't, then look into it, and get in touch with Shumela, get in touch with myself, and we will point you in the right direction. But yeah, everybody should make an attempt to become trauma informed.
Thanks, Ashley. Shumela? Very much echo everything that Ashley said, and I think as well is remembering that what trauma-informed practice does, and the most important thing about it is it significantly benefits those who have experienced trauma, and it takes us from thinking, which I think people are doing less now, which is what's wrong with that person, what's wrong with those people, to what happened to that person, what happened to those families, those individuals, those people, because that fundamentally changes how we think. It removes the judgment, it helps us be more empathetic and compassionate and understanding. And ultimately, as well as having the benefit to survivors and people who have experienced trauma, trauma-informed practice makes better systems, it makes better staff, it makes better staff supports. It really focuses on workforce well-being. That's one of the 5 organisational key drivers. And data as well, it's really, really important to assess and trying to continuously improve. One of the things I love about trauma-informed practice is I think it will be ever evolving as society changes, as people's needs change, as they develop, as organisations change, and there's so many different things to consider. So normally people create a framework or they create a thing and it's got to be solid and it's got to sit there and just stand alone and nobody wants to move from it. Trauma-informed practice needs to adapt to the organisation and the individual that it's seeking to serve. We know that because we practice it every single day, and how we're trauma-informed with one individual coming through our doors might be very different to how we're trauma-informed with another individual, because it's about the individual and that's what trauma is about. It's not about the event. Trauma is about the experience experienced by the individual, and that's why you need to take that approach and understand that it's not a one size fits all. It really, really can't be. I suppose that's one of the most important things to remember, is it's not a one size fits all, and people with lived experience need to be at the heart of any of your plans, your designs, your training. They've got to be involved. That's in essence what makes it trauma-informed.
Thanks, ladies, for your chat today, and thank you for everyone who's watched.